Welcome everyone to Things Around 8. Dear friends, this video will talk about President Biden's authorization for Ukraine to use Western weapons against targets inside Russia, and the Kremlin's response, which said that this will give the Russians the right to retaliate with nuclear weapons. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and click on the notification bell so you don't miss any news. On Thursday, May 30th, President Biden finally relaxed the restrictions imposed on Ukraine on the use of American weapons in the context of the Russian invasion. Before this relaxation, the United States' position was very restrictive, completely preventing Ukraine from using American weapons against Russian targets inside Russian territory, allowing the use of these weapons only against Russian military targets located in Ukrainian territory under Russian military occupation. Therefore, weapons such as strikes, with a range of up to 300 kilometers, could not be used against the important Russian weapons and ammunition depots spread across Russian territory along the entire Ukrainian border. However, it is important to emphasize that this flexibility is limited, with President Biden authorizing Ukraine to strike only military targets on Russian territory that are directly or indirectly involved in the Russian offensive against northern Kharkiv. Of all Ukraine's major allies, the United States was the last to ease the use of munitions against targets in Russia, with countries such as France, the Netherlands, and the United Kingdom already offering this freedom of action to the Ukrainians. Denmark went even further, authorizing Ukraine to use the F-16 fighters it will provide to strike Russian military targets inside Russia. And also, unlike the United States, these countries do not impose geographic limits on the use of these weapons, with the only condition imposed by these countries being that they be used exclusively against legitimate military targets. When the West began supplying weapons to Ukraine, shortly after the Russian invasion began, their great fear was that Russia would view this aid as their official entry into the war. And so, in order to prevent the escalation of the conflict, a restriction was imposed on the use of these weapons, prohibiting Ukraine from using them against Russian military targets inside Russia. Because of this restriction, Russia has always been free to build large weapons and ammunition depots along the Ukrainian border. Ukraine has been forced to use only locally designed and manufactured drones for attacks against Russian positions inside Russia. As you can imagine, the advantages gained by Russia due to these restrictions were very significant, and in fact, according to the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, Russia only opened a new front north of Kharkiv on May 10th because Ukraine was not allowed to use Western weapons against the large concentrations of troops, weapons and ammunition that Vladimir Putin had set up along the border between Belgorod and Kharkiv. According to Kiev, if there had been no such restriction, the Russian offensive against Kharkiv in May would not have been launched at all. But why has the West now begun to relax the rules on the use of its weapons by Ukraine? The main reason for this is the increasing intensity of the war, with Vladimir Putin militarizing the Russian economy, recruiting hundreds of thousands of soldiers and forming new armies. With Russia increasingly committed to capturing and annexing Ukrainian territories, with many of these actions involving, as I mentioned here, the opening of new fronts from within Russian territory, the West had no alternative but to free Ukraine to use its weapons against targets inside Russia. A decision that, as we can well imagine, deeply displeased Russia, with senior members of Putin's regime even threatening to respond to these attacks with nuclear weapons. According to the Russian constitution, Russia can only use nuclear weapons in two situations: in response to a nuclear attack or to counter threats to the country's territorial integrity. Therefore, by law, Russia cannot launch nuclear weapons against Ukraine in response to attacks with mere conventional weapons. But Russia is an autocracy, seen by many as a veritable dictatorship, controlled with an iron fist by Vladimir Putin. This means that the law in Russia serves only to satisfy Putin's objectives. And so, if Putin really wants to, he can claim anything to justify a nuclear attack against Ukraine. But he knows very well that by doing so, he will be opening a door that can never be closed again. By launching a nuclear attack against a non-nuclear nation, in response to attacks with merely conventional weapons, Putin will open a new chapter in the history of war, in which the use of nuclear weapons is completely commonplace, completely distorting the purpose of these weapons, which is merely deterrence, and further increasing the risk of a generalized nuclear conflict in the world. Therefore, despite all Putin's desperation to achieve his expansionist goals in Ukraine, he knows that this desperation has a limit, which, however tempting it may be, he cannot cross. This means that, most likely, Russia's response to attacks by Western weapons against Russian military targets inside its territory will involve increasing Russian airstrikes in Ukraine, with many of these attacks specifically targeting Ukrainian civilians. A classic Russian tactic that involves taking it out on Ukrainian civilians whenever Ukraine achieves some kind of tactical advantage or victory on the battlefield. In practical terms, Ukraine's relaxation of the use of Western weapons will bring a great advantage to Kyiv, which will now be able to create much more efficient counterattack tactics against the Russian invasion force. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any news.